There is a kind of madness, quiet and particular, that takes hold of people who look at mountains and feel not fear, but hunger. Not everyone feels it. Most people look at the great peaks of this world and understand intuitively that those are places they are not meant to go, places where the rules of ordinary survival no longer apply, where the body begins to fail in ways that medicine cannot fully explain, and where the mind, starved of oxygen, turns strange and unreliable. But some people feel the pull anyway. They train for years, they spend fortunes, they leave behind spouses and children and careers, and they go. They go because the mountain is there, as George Mallory once said. And for some people that answer is enough. It has always been enough. What those people know, and what gets lost in the glossy photographs and the adventure magazine spreads and the polished documentary footage, is that the world's great peaks operate by a different mathematics than the world below. Down here, when something goes wrong, when the weather turns or the road gets icy or someone falls ill, there are systems in place, emergency services, hospitals, neighbors. Up there, past a certain altitude, you are so far beyond the reach of any of that the word rescue becomes almost theoretical. Above 8,000 meters, the altitude mountaineers call the death zone. The human body is not simply challenged, it is actively dying. Every breath pulls in roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. The brain, which demands more oxygen than any other organ, begins making mistakes. Judgment deteriorates. Coordination frays. Hallucinations arrive. People make decisions up there that they would never make anywhere else. Decisions that feel logical in the moment and look catastrophic in hindsight. And that is on a clear day, on a good day, on the kind of day when the sky is blue and the wind is manageable and the route is intact. What happens on the bad days is something else entirely. On May 10th, 1996, 33 climbers were scattered across the upper slopes of Mount Everest, the highest point on the surface of the Earth. They had come from multiple expeditions, multiple countries, multiple backgrounds. Some were seasoned professionals. Some were wealthy adventurers who had paid tens of thousands of dollars for the privilege of having experienced guides help them reach the top of the world. All of them were operating in conditions that would have been unthinkable anywhere else. The two most prominent expeditions that day were adventure consultants, led by a highly respected New Zealand guide named Rob Hall, and Mountain Madness, led by an American guide named Scott Fisher. Both men had built their businesses on the premise that, with the right preparation and the right leadership, Everest was achievable for capable clients who were willing to accept the physical demands and the financial cost. Hall had led 39 clients to the summit across multiple seasons. He was not careless. He was not reckless. He was, by every account, one of the most competent high-altitude guides on Earth. None of that would matter. The problems began accumulating long before the storm arrived, and they accumulated the way disasters usually do, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a series of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and became deadly only in combination. The first issue was a traffic jam. Multiple expeditions had converged on the same narrow route on the same day, and the Hillary Step, a near vertical rock face close to the summit, had not had its fixed ropes prepared in advance. Climbers arrived to find no rope and had to wait while guides set it up on the spot. The delay cost them time they could not afford. Turnaround time is one of the most important concepts in high-altitude mountaineering. Because a summit attempt is only half the journey, experienced guides set a predetermined time, typically early afternoon. after which they will turn around regardless of whether the summit has been reached, because a late summit means a late descent, and a late descent means the descent happens in darkness and deteriorating conditions. Rob Hall had established a turnaround time of 2 in the afternoon. By the time the delays at the Hillary Step resolved and climbers began reaching the summit, many of them were already past that window. Hall's client, Doug Hansen, was one of them. Hansen was a postal worker from Washington State, a quiet, determined man who had attempted Everest the year before with Hall and had turned back just a few hundred meters from the top. He had come back in 1996 specifically to finish what he had started. By the time Hansen reached the summit on the afternoon of May 10th, he was among the last to do so, and the timeline had long since slipped beyond safety. Hall, unwilling to abandon a client who had already once failed to reach the top, stayed with him. The storm hit in the early evening. What descended on the upper slopes of Everest that night was not a freak event in the sense of being unforeseeable. Later analysis revealed that the weather teams at base camp had been receiving forecasts indicating deteriorating conditions, though there is continuing debate about exactly how clearly that information was communicated and acted upon. What is not debated is what the storm felt like to the people caught inside it. Winds in excess of 70 miles per hour, temperatures plunging to minus 40 degrees, visibility dropping to nothing, so completely that climbers standing inches apart could lose each other in seconds. Scott Fisher, who had been showing signs of exhaustion and possible altitude sickness even before the summit push began, was unable to descend when the storm hit. He had summited late, later than anyone realized, and he was too depleted to move. His lead Sherpa, Lobsang Jangbu, stayed with him for a time before being persuaded to leave. Fisher's body was found the next day, high on the mountain, where the cold had taken him. Closer to the top, Rob Hall was still with Doug Hansen at the Hillary Step when Hansen lost consciousness. Hall radioed his base camp. His guide, Andy Harris, stationed below, turned around and climbed back up through the storm carrying oxygen and water, an act of extraordinary courage that cost him his life. Harris was never found. His body has never been recovered. While Hall was dying near the summit, other dramas were unfolding lower on the mountain that would eventually produce one of the most improbable survival stories in climbing history. A group of climbers from both expeditions had become hopelessly disoriented in the whiteout conditions on the South Col, the high plateau below the summit, and had spent the night crouched in the open without shelter, some in hypothermic comas, at an altitude where the temperature was dropping below minus 40 degrees. Among them was Beck Weathers, an American pathologist from Dallas, who was part of Hall's client group. By morning, he was not moving. He was assumed dead. Rescue teams passed him by. And then, in one of those moments that defies every physiological explanation, Beck Weathers opened his eyes. He stood up. His right arm was almost completely destroyed by frostbite, turned black and rigid, a grotesque club of dead tissue. His face was almost unrecognizable. He was functionally blind, but he was alive. He walked back to camp. He was evacuated by helicopter in what rescuers described as one of the highest altitude helicopter rescues ever attempted. He eventually had his right hand and forearm amputated, his left hand partially amputated, and his nose reconstructed. He survived. He wrote a book. He is still alive. The contrast between Weathers' improbable survival and the deaths of Hall and Fisher speaks to something that climbers and mountaineers have wrestled with for as long as people have been going to high places. The line between survival and death at altitude is not always drawn by skill or preparation. Sometimes it is drawn by something that feels uncomfortably close to chance, to the particular angle of the wind, to the precise moment when a body's reserves give out, or, mysteriously, do not. Hall spent the night on the mountain, at an altitude of roughly 8,700 meters, with no sleeping bag, no shelter, frostbitten hands and feet, and temperatures that no human body can withstand indefinitely. He was still alive the following morning. He made radio contact with his base camp team, and then, sometime in the afternoon of May 11th, as it became clear that no rescue could reach him in time, he asked his team to connect a satellite phone call to New Zealand, where his wife Jan Arnold was home and pregnant with their first child. The conversation has been recounted in Jon Krakauer's account of the disaster, and it is one of the most devastating things in the literature of mountaineering. Hall and Jan spoke about the baby. They discussed a name. He told her he was reasonably comfortable. He told her not to worry too much. He told her to sleep well. Then he died where he lay, on the upper ridge of Everest, and his body was never moved. His wife later said she thought he was where he would have liked to stay. 8 people died in total during those 2 days on Everest, making it then the single deadliest season in the mountain's history. The aftermath produced enormous controversy, especially after Jon Krakauer published his account of the events in the book Into Thin Air, which became a massive bestseller and forced a public reckoning with the commercialization of Everest. The question of whether guiding services had created a false sense of accessibility around a mountain that remained fundamentally indifferent to human ambition. Krakauer himself spent years afterward processing what had happened, eventually disclosing that the experience left him with post-traumatic stress disorder and guilt so deep it reshaped him. The broader question that the 1996 disaster raised, and that has never been fully answered, is one about the nature of the mountain itself. Everest is not the most technically demanding of the world's great peaks. It is not by any purely technical measure the most dangerous. But it is the highest, and height has its own brutal arithmetic, and the 1996 disaster demonstrated in the most terrible possible way that no amount of experience, no amount of money, no amount of preparation is sufficient guarantee against what the mountain can do when it decides to remind you that you do not belong there. 12 years after the Everest disaster, in the summer of 2008, the mountaineering world watched in horror as a different mountain extracted a toll that, in terms of sheer concentrated carnage within a brief window of time, had no precedent in modern climbing history. K2 is the second highest mountain on Earth, rising to 8,611 meters at the border between Pakistan and China, and among serious mountaineers, it carries a reputation that Everest, for all its fame, simply cannot match. Everest is the highest. K2 is the hardest. Climbers who have stood on the summit of both describe K2 in the reverent, slightly haunted terms that people use when they have looked at something that came very close to killing them and felt grateful simply to have survived the looking. Its slopes are steeper, its weather more violent, its technical challenges more relentless. And for decades, it carried a fatality to summit ratio that served as a cold rebuke to anyone who thought that experience and skill provided meaningful protection there. The most dangerous section of the standard route up K2, the Abruzzi Spur, is a stretch known as the bottleneck. The name is almost too benign for what it describes. The bottleneck is a steep, narrow couloir at roughly 8,200 meters, a channel of glare ice pitched at about 60 degrees, and it sits directly below an enormous formation of glacial ice called the Great Serac. Climbers who traverse the bottleneck do so under that serac. There is no alternative. The Serek hangs above them like a suspended building, like a cathedral of ice that has never quite finished falling. And the only strategy for dealing with it is to move through the bottleneck as quickly as possible and pray. In the summer of 2008, more climbing expeditions than usual had converged on K2 and were waiting for the weather to allow a summit attempt. By late July, a window appeared to be opening, and on August 1st, somewhere between 20 and 25 climbers from multiple national teams began their push for the top. They were an experienced group. These were not wealthy amateur clients being guided up a commercial route. These were skilled, accomplished mountaineers from South Korea, Norway, France, Ireland, the Netherlands, Pakistan, Nepal, and Serbia, people who had collectively climbed dozens of major peaks and knew the risks as well as anyone on Earth knew them. The first trouble came during the ascent, before anyone had reached the summit. A Serbian climber named Dren Mandic unclipped from the fixed rope to pass another climber at the bottleneck and fell. Witnesses say he appeared to stand after the fall and was believed to be alive. The teams made a brief collective decision not to halt the summit attempt, judging that there were enough climbers below to help. A Pakistani climber named Jahan Beg went down to assist Mandic and also fell to his death. 2 people were gone before the summit was even reached. The rest pushed on. The delays caused by the incidents at the bottleneck, combined with earlier slowdowns due to rope fixing problems, meant that climbers were reaching the summit far later than planned. Alberto Zerain, a Basque alpinist who had set out early and climbed efficiently, reached the top around 3:30 in the afternoon and made it back through the bottleneck while conditions still permitted a safe passage. But most of the others did not summit until much later, some not until 8 in the evening. By the time the full group of 18 summiteers began their descent, K2 was wrapped in darkness. At 8:30 that night, as the Norwegian team was nearing the traverse that led to the top of the bottleneck, the Great Serac released. There is no adequate way to describe what a Serac collapse sounds like from below, from the perspective of someone who has no warning, no time, no option but to absorb what is happening. The Serac had hung in place for decades. It had been there every season, season after season, enormous and stable and threatening and never quite falling. And then, on that night, it fell. The Serac severed every fixed rope across the bottleneck in one savage motion. 3 people were killed instantly. Among them was Rolf Bae, a Norwegian climber who had chosen not to continue his own summit push and had instead told his wife, fellow climber Cecilia Skog, to go on without him while he waited at the bottleneck. He told his teammate Lars Nessa to look after her. He was struck and swept away by the falling ice before she was back down. The destruction of the fixed ropes was in some ways more catastrophic than the initial deaths, because it transformed the descent from something difficult and dangerous into something that required free solo movement in total darkness at the edge of the death zone without the protective lines that the teams had counted on. No one had brought additional ropes because no one had planned for the ropes they had to cease to exist. Panic, by multiple survivor accounts, spread through the climbers still above the traverse. Some chose to attempt the descent in the dark. Others bivouacked where they were, huddled at altitude without shelter or sleeping bags, hoping to survive the night and descend in daylight. Dutch climber Wilco van Rooyen, in a hospital bed days later, described the chaos in terms that make the skin feel cold, even reading them from safety. Everyone was fighting for himself. People were running but did not know where to go. Some ended up on the wrong side of the mountain entirely. The night consumed more lives. a French climber fell somewhere above the bottleneck. A Pakistani climber was killed by a secondary icefall. An Irish climber named Ger McDonnell, who had apparently spent part of that terrible night trying to free Korean climbers tangled in rope near the traverse, was swept away by another serac fall. 2 Nepalese Sherpas, cousins who had gone up from camp to help the stricken Korean team, were also killed in that same collapse. When the killing was finally over, 11 people were dead, 11 in under 48 hours on a single stretch of mountain, the victims of a single ice formation that had simply decided, after decades of threatening, to finally move. Van Rooyen was found wandering the lower slopes, snow-blind and incoherent. Marco Confortola, an Italian climber who had survived a night exposed to the death zone, crawled down on his hands and knees. Cecilia Skog descended the mountain alone after losing her husband. The sheer concentration of tragedy during those 2 days made K2's Black Summer of 2008, as it became known, unique in the modern history of high-altitude climbing. 11 skilled, experienced mountaineers, some of the best in the world, erased in less than 2 days by a mountain that had simply decided it was done with them. And yet the bottleneck is still there. Climbers still traverse it every season. The Great Serac still hangs above it, slightly smaller now than it was before August of 2008, but still there, still suspended, still waiting. But there are mountains that do not require altitude to kill, mountains where the danger does not come from the death zone, or the Serac fields, or the impossible weather of the Himalayan winter. Some mountains kill not through the slow accumulation of hypoxia and cold and exhaustion, but through sudden, total violence. The kind of violence that arrives without warning and ends everything it touches in minutes. In the Andean valleys of north-central Peru, the town of Yungay had existed for generations in the shadow of Huascarán, the highest mountain in the country. A massive peak of ice and rock that rose to over 6,700 meters above the narrow valley floor. Yungay was a small, prosperous town by Andean standards, known locally as the Pearl of the Huelas Corridor for its pleasant situation and picturesque setting. The mountains around it were beautiful. They had always been beautiful. They had also, as it turned out, been quietly building towards something. Scientists knew. 2 American researchers, David Bernays and Charles Sawyer, had documented in 1962 that a massive vertical slab of rock on the north face of Huascarán was being undermined by glacier movement, and that if it fell, the resulting avalanche would destroy Yungay. They published their findings. When the report appeared in a Lima newspaper in September of 1962, the Peruvian government ordered both scientists to retract their findings under threat of imprisonment. They fled the country. The citizens of the valley were officially told there was nothing to worry about. Officials were concerned about panic and about the economic impact on a region that depended on tourism. 8 years after that warning was suppressed, on January 10, 1962, an avalanche from a different section of the same glacier killed more than 4,000 people in the nearby town of Ranrahirka. Yungay was spared. The mountain had given a warning that felt, to many, like a near miss rather than a preview. Then came Sunday, May 31st, 1970. It was a Sunday afternoon. The markets were closed, families were home. A circus had drawn a couple of hundred children from Yungay to a neighboring town for a free show. The streets of Yungay were full of the ordinary afternoon rhythms of a Peruvian mountain town in late spring. At 3:23 in the afternoon, an undersea earthquake struck off the coast of Peru, a 7.9 magnitude event that shook the entire region with a violence that collapsed buildings across an area larger than Belgium and the Netherlands combined. The earthquake alone killed tens of thousands of people across the region. But what happened on the face of Huascarán in the minutes after the earthquake began was something different and more final. The violent shaking dislodged a slab of rock and ice roughly 800 meters wide and 1.6 kilometers long from the north face of Huascarán. The slab fell approximately 600 meters, nearly vertically, before it struck Glacier 511 below, and the impact transformed it. It gathered snow and ice as it descended. It gathered rock and soil. It became something that is difficult to categorize by ordinary terms. Not quite a landslide, not quite an avalanche, not quite a flood, but all of those things simultaneously. A roaring, churning mass of perhaps 80 million cubic meters of debris hurtling down the mountain at speeds that would reach, by some estimates, between 280 and 335 kilometers per hour. A survivor named Mateo Casaverde described what he saw from a distance, and his words have been quoted in accounts of the disaster ever since because there is no better description available. He heard a deep noise coming from the mountain, different from the earthquake, but not entirely separate from it either. He saw between the mountain and the town a giant cloud of dust. He watched a wave of gray mud 60 meters high bear down on the side of Yungay. He watched the sky go dark. And then Yungay and its thousands of inhabitants had simply disappeared. The flow reached the town approximately 3 minutes after the initial collapse. There was not enough time to run. There was not enough time to do anything at all. The wave of debris was moving faster than any human being can move on flat ground, let alone on Andean slopes, and it was 60 meters high. The few hundred people who survived did so because they happened to be in elevated positions when the flow arrived, in the cemetery on a small hill above the town center, in the stadium, on the slopes of the surrounding hills. The circus in the neighboring town saved the lives of roughly 200 children who would otherwise have been in Yungay that afternoon. Approximately 20,000 people died in Yungay in a matter of minutes. The town essentially ceased to exist. It was not damaged or partially destroyed in the way that towns are described after earthquakes or floods. It was buried under meters of rock and mud and ice that solidified around everything it covered, around the cathedral, around the market stalls, around the houses and the streets and the people in them, and preserved it all in a kind of terrible permanence. The Peruvian government subsequently declared the site a national cemetery and forbade excavation. The bodies remain where they fell. When visitors walk through the memorial area today, they walk above a city of 20,000 people frozen in the moment of their deaths, beneath their feet but completely out of reach. 4 palm trees still stand, protected by a church wall that briefly slowed the debris flow. Twisted remnants of iron gates and the tops of buses can still be seen poking up through the ground. The ruins of the cathedral rise above the debris like a broken tooth. A new Yungay was built a short distance north of the old site. The mountain is still there, still beautiful, still enormous, still looking down on the valley and the town that grew back from its shadow. The scientists who tried to warn people in 1962 were never formally vindicated in their lifetimes. From the smothered streets of Peru to the sky-high corridors of Nepal, what kills in the mountains is often not a single catastrophic event, but a slow accumulation of variables pressing against the limits of the survivable. Few mountains have accumulated more of those variables, or extracted a higher continuous toll on those who attempt them, than the mountain known to the rest of the world by a name so deceptively simple, it sounds almost gentle: Annapurna. It does not sound like the deadliest mountain on earth. Its name comes from the Hindu goddess of food and nourishment. In the local language, it means something close to full of food, or she who bestows nourishment. There is a deep and uncomfortable irony in that etymology when you look at what the mountain has done to the people who have climbed it, because Annapurna has, for much of its climbing history, consumed more lives relative to the number of successful summits than any other 8,000er on Earth. For decades, its fatality to summit ratio hovered at approximately 32%. 1 in 3 climbers who reached the top did not come home. Not 1 in 100, 1 in 3. To put that number in perspective against the other mountains we have discussed, Everest, famous for its danger and its body count, has historically carried a fatality rate of roughly 1% to 4%, depending on the era and the methodology of calculation. Even K2, the Savage Mountain, which climbers consider significantly more dangerous than Everest, has a fatality rate of roughly 20 to 24%. Annapurna has spent most of its climbing history killing at a rate that dwarfs both of them. And unlike K2, where the extreme technical difficulty filters out all but the most capable climbers, Annapurna's deadliness is not purely a matter of technical challenge. It is a matter of avalanche, of weather, of terrain that concentrates risk in ways that experience and preparation can mitigate, but cannot eliminate. To understand why Annapurna kills at this rate, you have to understand what it looks like from the technical perspective of the people who climb it. At 8,091 meters, it is the 10th highest mountain in the world, not the most famous, not the most photographed, not the one that fills the adventure magazines. But its routes, particularly the south face, are among the most technically demanding and objectively dangerous of any peak in the Himalayan range. The south face rises 3,000 meters from base to summit in a nearly continuous wall of ice and crumbling rock and exposed ridgelines that channel wind and concentrate avalanche. There are no moderate approaches. Every route requires technical ice climbing at extreme altitude. And the weather on Annapurna is particularly volatile, particular in its tendency to change without warning and trap climbers in places from which there is no rapid descent. The mountain claimed its first victims on the very first attempt to summit it. The 1950 French expedition, led by Maurice Herzog, made it to the top and became the first team to summit any of the world's 8,000ers. It was a historic achievement. It was also a catastrophe. Herzog and his partner Louis Lachinal descended in a worsening storm, lost their gloves, spent a night exposed to temperatures that froze their fingers and toes, and were ultimately carried off the mountain by their teammates after suffering frostbite so severe that multiple amputations were required. Herzog lost all his toes and most of his fingers. Lachinal lost all his toes. Their survival was, by any honest assessment, a matter of luck as much as competence. Since that first ascent, Annapurna's slopes have taken the lives of some of mountaineering's most accomplished figures. Among them was Anatoly Bukriv, the Russian-Kazakhstani guide who had been one of the most controversial figures in the 1996 Everest disaster, whose courage in descending alone multiple times into the storm to rescue stranded climbers was credited with saving several lives, and whose decision to climb without supplemental oxygen had been criticized by Krakauer. Bukriv died on Annapurna in December of 1997, swept away by an avalanche during a winter attempt. But the mountain's killing is not limited to the climbers who attempt the summit. In October of 2014, Annapurna demonstrated that it could kill people who were not even trying to reach its top. The Annapurna circuit is one of the most famous trekking routes in Nepal, a long loop through the foothills and passes surrounding the Annapurna Massif that draws tens of thousands of visitors every year. The highest point of the circuit is the Thorong La Pass, at 5,416 meters, well below the technical climbing zones and accessible to fit experienced hikers with proper preparation. Trekkers who complete the circuit typically spend weeks on the trail, acclimatizing gradually and moving through villages that have hosted travelers for generations. It is considered difficult by hiking standards, but not inherently dangerous, in the way that actual mountaineering is dangerous. On October 14, 2014, roughly 200 trekkers were in or near the Thorong La Pass when weather descended on the region that had nothing to do with typical Himalayan autumn conditions. The storm was the remnants of Cyclone Hudhud, which had originated off the coast of Thailand, intensified dramatically over the Bay of Bengal, struck the Indian coastline with catastrophic force, and then done something meteorologically unusual, tracked north and inland into the Himalayas, drawing moisture and energy with it that had no business being at those altitudes. What arrived at the Thorong La was approximately 1.8 meters of snow within 12 hours, accompanied by avalanches that scoured the higher passes and cut off every route of retreat and advance simultaneously. The trekkers caught on the pass and the trails leading to it had received no warning. There was no system in place to communicate rapidly developing weather to people already in the field. Cell service and electrical power in the affected region failed almost immediately under the storm. Emergency shelters on the Annapurna circuit were inadequate in number and condition for the kind of crisis that was unfolding. People tried to move, some ran, some collapsed in the snow from exhaustion and hypothermia. Survivors would later describe walking past bodies on the trail, people who had simply stopped in the cold and not gotten up again, their outlines visible beneath the accumulating snow. The lucky ones found shelter behind boulders, in buildings, in anything that blocked the wind long enough for their body temperatures to stay above the lethal threshold. When it was over, 43 people were dead, including 21 foreign trekkers from multiple countries and a number of local Nepali guides, cooks, and yak herders. 175 more were injured, many of them suffering frostbite severe enough to require amputations. It was the worst single-day trekking disaster in Nepalese history, and it happened not in the death zone, not on a technical climbing route, but on a trail that had welcomed hikers for decades without serious incident. The Nepalese government faced enormous criticism in the aftermath for the absence of any real-time weather communication system for people on the trail, for the failure to warn trekkers about the approaching cyclone-derived storm, and for the inadequacy of emergency infrastructure. The Prime Minister called the losses extremely tragic and said that improvements to weather warning systems would be made. Proposed new procedures included trekker registries, GPS tracking, and mandatory use of local guides. Annapurna itself simply continued to exist, enormous and indifferent, as it always had. There are other kinds of stories that come out of the high mountains, quieter ones that take longer to resolve, stories that involve not a single catastrophic day, but years of mystery, controversy, and a grief that had no body to bury and no final answer to hold on to. And among those stories, few are more haunted or more complicated than what happened on Nanga Parbat in the summer of 1970. Nanga Parbat has been killing climbers since the first serious attempts to summit it in the 19th century. Hermann Buhl, one of the greatest mountaineers of his generation, made the first ascent in 1953 in a feat of endurance so extreme it is still held up as one of the benchmark achievements in the history of the sport. He climbed the final section alone, without supplemental oxygen, reached the summit as darkness fell, and stood through the night unable to descend, hanging on the upper ridge in temperatures that should have killed him. He survived and descended the next day, but he lost toes to frostbite and spent months recovering. Nanga Parbat's Rakiot face, from which Buhl approached the summit, had already by that point accumulated a history of German and Austrian expedition deaths that stretched back to the 1930s. The 1934 expedition, in which expedition leader Willy Merkel and 8 others perished in a storm, became one of the defining tragedies of pre-war mountaineering. The 1937 expedition wiped out the entire high camp, killing 7 climbers and 9 Sherpas in an avalanche that struck while most were sleeping. By the time Buhl finally stood on the summit in 1953, Nanga Parbat had already claimed 31 lives in failed attempts, more than any other peak had killed without ever having been summited. In the summer of 1970, the same summer that the earthquake took Yungay in Peru, a German expedition arrived at the base of Nanga Parbat in what is now northern Pakistan, aiming to climb what mountaineers have long called the Killer Mountain, the 9th highest peak in the world, and one of the most technically forbidding. Nanga Parbat's nickname comes partly from its difficulty and partly from its history, which is soaked in blood in a way that is unusual even for the Himalayas. Its Rupal face, the south side of the mountain, rises nearly 5 kilometers from its base to its summit, making it the tallest mountain face on Earth. A vertical world of ice and rock so vast that climbers have described the experience of standing at the bottom of it as something closer to looking at a landscape than a mountain wall. Among the expedition's members were 2 brothers from South Tyrol, a mountainous region in northern Italy that has historically produced extraordinary climbers. The older brother, Reinhold, was 25 years old and already considered one of the most technically gifted young climbers in Europe. The younger brother, Günther, was 24, also highly capable, added to the expedition roster at the last moment to fill a vacancy. The expedition leader was Karl Herrlichhofer, a man whose relationship with Nanga Parbat was personal and obsessive. His half-brother, a climber named Willy Merkel, had died on Nanga Parbat in 1934, along with 8 other climbers. Herrlichhofer had organized multiple expeditions to the mountain over the years, driven by a complicated mixture of grief and ambition, and something that looked, from the outside, like an inability to let go. The summit attempt began on June 26, 1970. High on the mountain, at Camp 5, the Messner brothers and a 3rd climber named Gerhard Bauer watched for a signal rocket from base camp. A blue rocket meant good weather. A red rocket meant bad weather and signaled a different, faster plan. What arrived from base camp was ambiguous. The rocket fired was supposed to be blue. It exploded red. Radio reports said the weather was good, but the rocket said bad. Reinhold, interpreting the red rocket as a signal to make a fast solo attempt before conditions deteriorated, left at roughly 2 in the morning. Günther, who had not been assigned a summit role for that day, made a decision that would eventually cost him his life. He went after his brother. He caught up with Reinhold in the Merkel couloir, and the 2 of them continued to the summit together, reaching the top on June 27th in one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of high-altitude mountaineering, a lightning-fast ascent of the world's tallest mountain face without supplemental oxygen or fixed ropes. They came down in a different direction than they had gone up. This is where the account becomes disputed territory, and where Reinhold Messner would spend decades of his life defending himself against accusations that, at their most serious, came close to accusing him of leaving his brother to die to protect his own summit achievement. What Messner has always said is that Günther had developed altitude sickness after the summit and was too debilitated to descend the Rupel face safely, that there was no rope, and that the only viable option was to descend the longer, less steep Diamir face on the other side. What other expedition members claimed was that Reinhold had abandoned his brother and descended the Rupel route alone. The controversy simmered and boiled for decades. Messner went on to become the most celebrated mountaineer in history, the first person to climb all 14 8,000ers, and the first to do so without supplemental oxygen. But the shadow of Nanga Parbat followed him. His former expedition colleagues published books attacking his account. He filed lawsuits. The arguments became public, bitter, and ultimately irresolvable because the central fact at issue, where exactly Günther died and how, remained unknown. The mountain had taken the evidence with it. Then, in July of 2000, a climber searching the base of the Diamir face found a human fibula, a leg bone, partially decomposed. Initial DNA analysis was inconclusive, but in July of 2005, 35 years after Günther Messner disappeared into the mountain, 3 local Pakistani guides found what remained of a climber's body at an altitude of 4,300 meters on the Diamir face, not far from where Reinhold had always said the avalanche that killed his brother had come down. The body was gone, mostly, dissolved and scattered across 3.5 decades of glacial movement. What remained were a leather boot, a wool-socked foot, and fragments of clothing. When word reached Reinhold Messner, he traveled to the mountain. He recognized the boot immediately, a brown leather Loa triple boot, the kind his brother had worn on the climb. He recognized the jacket. DNA testing confirmed it definitively. The remains were Günther Messner's. The location on the Diamir face supported Reinhold's account of their descent. The controversy was not entirely extinguished, because questions about the precise location of the remains within the glacier continued to be argued by those who had spent years accusing Reinhold. But the core of his story, that Günther had died on the Diamir side of the mountain after they had descended together, was validated. Reinhold Messner burned his brother's remains on a pyre at the foot of Nanga Parbat, following Tibetan tradition. He built a small stone monument, a chorten, at the site. The participants, as he later described it, sang and threw rice into the air. In 2022, a second boot was recovered from the Diamir Glacier by a Pakistani climber who had been searching for minerals. It was returned to Reinhold. He called it a message from his brother across the distance of 52 years, a final confirmation of the truth he had told and had never quite been fully believed for telling. Nanga Parbat still stands. It is still the killer mountain. Its fatality rate, though it has improved over the decades as equipment and knowledge have advanced, remains among the highest in the world. The Rupel face is still there, still 5 kilometers of vertical ice and rock, still more mountain wall than most people will see in a lifetime of looking. And yet there is a category of mountain danger that even the most prepared, most experienced, most technically capable climber in the world cannot anticipate, prepare for, or survive, because it comes not from above or around, but from beneath, from the mountain itself, from processes that have been building invisibly for years and that reveal themselves in a single instant without any warning that the human ear or eye can detect in time. Japan is a country that lives with volcanic reality the way other countries live with weather. There are over 100 potentially active volcanoes in the Japanese archipelago, and they are woven into the culture in ways that go far deeper than geology. Mountains have been sacred in Japan since long before written history. They are places of spiritual significance, places where the boundary between the human world and something older and more powerful grows thin. Pilgrims have climbed Japanese peaks for centuries, not for athletic achievement, but for devotion. Mount Ontake, the 14th highest mountain in Japan and the second highest volcano after Fuji, rises to 3,067 meters in the Nagano and Gifu prefectures, roughly 100 kilometers northeast of Nagoya. It is a mountain that inspires the particular kind of affection that the Japanese have for places that combine beauty with religious meaning. Its slopes are home to a major Shugendo practice site, an ancient tradition of ascetic spiritual cultivation through mountain climbing. It has 5 volcanic crater lakes. In autumn, its upper slopes turn brilliant shades of orange and red as the leaves change, and the combination of spiritual atmosphere and seasonal beauty draws hikers by the thousands. It was also, as of the morning of September 27, 2014, considered a safe enough mountain for ordinary hikers on what was becoming one of the most popular hiking weekends of the year. That Saturday was everything a hiker could have hoped for. The sky was clear and blue. The autumn colors were at their peak, the best that the season had produced after several rainy weekends that had kept people away. It was a Saturday. The combination of good weather, spectacular foliage, and an accessible mountain drew several hundred hikers to Ontake's slopes that morning, ranging from serious trekkers pushing toward the summit to casual day hikers simply wanting to be in the mountains during the turning of the leaves. At 11:52 in the morning, at the precise moment when many of those hikers were at or near the summit, taking photographs, eating their lunches, sitting down to rest on rocks that had been there for centuries, Mount Ontake erupted. There was no warning, not a warning that any of the people on the mountain could have perceived or acted on. The Japan Meteorological Agency had instrumentation monitoring the mountain, but phreatic eruptions, which are steam-driven explosions caused by groundwater superheating and flashing to steam rather than by the movement of magma, often produce no seismic signal large enough to trigger automated alerts before they occur. Some tilt sensors had recorded a slight change about 7 minutes before the eruption began, but 7 minutes is not enough time to evacuate hundreds of people from a mountain summit, and the monitoring systems were not designed to issue public warnings based on changes that small. A phreatic eruption does not look like the eruptions most people imagine when they think of volcanoes. There is no lava. There is no dramatic, slow movement of glowing rock. What comes out of a phreatic eruption is steam and water and volcanic ash, and, most dangerously, ballistic ejecta, rocks propelled by the explosive pressure of boiling groundwater with enough force to kill at substantial distances. The eruption of Ontake generated an eruption column that reached approximately 11 kilometers into the sky. It generated pyroclastic flows, dense ground-hugging currents of ash and gas that traveled down the valley at roughly 32 kilometers per hour, and it buried the upper slopes of the mountain under a thick layer of hot volcanic ash and rock fragments that arrived faster than anyone could run. The videos taken by hikers in the seconds and minutes after the eruption began are among the most disturbing documents in the history of natural disasters, not because of gore, but because of the complete absence of any time to comprehend what is happening before it is already happening. One moment the mountain is peaceful, the sky is blue, people are having lunch. The next moment, a gray-black wall of ash is rolling down the slopes at speed, and people are running and screaming, and then, in some cases, simply gone. Some hikers reached the shelter of mountain huts and barricaded themselves inside. Others found boulders and crouched behind them. Some put on construction helmets that happened to be stored in the huts, a detail that, in its terrible improvisation, captures something true about the difference between what emergency planning imagines and what emergency reality delivers. The most common injuries among survivors were impact injuries to the back, where volcanic rocks had struck them as they ran, suggesting that many of them made it through the initial barrage facing away from the vent and moving. Many did not make it. Rescue workers who reached the summit areas in the days following the eruption found the dead where they had fallen. Several victims, it was reported, were found in positions that looked like prayer, kneeling or crouching with their hands together, or lying curled as if in sleep. The volcanic ash had settled over them and around them, preserving the posture of their final moments. The eruption had happened so suddenly, so completely without warning, that some of them had had no time to do anything but fold inward against what was coming. 63 people died. 5 bodies were never recovered, buried under the ash and rock of a mountain that had decided, on a beautiful autumn Saturday during the peak foliage season, to remind the hikers on its slopes that beneath the beauty and the centuries of spiritual tradition and the carefully maintained trail systems, it was still a volcano. It had always been a volcano. The only thing that had changed was that it had stopped being quiet. The Japanese government and scientific community faced a reckoning in the aftermath about the limitations of volcanic monitoring, about the physical impossibility of providing meaningful warning team for phreatic eruptions without detection systems that can monitor subsurface hydrothermal processes at resolution and speed that current technology does not permit. The Earthquake Research Institute's assessments post-eruption estimated that the eruption was preceded by intense boiling of groundwater that fractured the rock, serving as a pressure barrier, and that this process was essentially invisible to surface monitoring until the fracturing was already completed and the explosion was already beginning. What that means in plain terms is that there was nothing anyone could have done, not the scientists, not the meteorological agency, not the hikers themselves. The mountain gave no warning that any existing system could have caught in time. It simply erupted in the middle of the day into a crowd of people who had every reason to feel safe. The volcano is still considered active. Hiking on Ontake was suspended for years following the eruption and only partially reopened under strict restrictions that now include mandatory registration of hikers, real-time monitoring displays near trailheads, and designated shelter locations. The mountain huts that may have saved some lives in 2014 were reinforced. New emergency shelters were constructed along the trail. But the deeper truth that Ontake revealed is one that scientists and emergency management officials have struggled to communicate without causing the kind of panic that would shut down every volcano-adjacent hiking trail in Japan. Phreatic eruptions are, by their nature, difficult to predict with current technology. They can occur at volcanoes that have been quiet for years or decades. They can happen at volcanoes that are considered safe enough for tourist infrastructure. They can happen at noon on a Saturday when the weather is beautiful and the foliage is at its peak, and several hundred people are having the best hiking day of the year. The summit area where 63 people died is still there. The crater from which the eruption came is still there, and on the slopes below the summit, under the layers of ash and rock that the mountain deposited in those terrible minutes, the imprints of that day remain in ways that no amount of subsequent trekking or new snowfall has fully erased. There is something that all of these places share: Everest and K2 and Huascarán and Annapurna and Nanga Parbat and Ontake. And it is not merely danger, though they are all dangerous. It is a kind of indifference. The mountains do not know that anyone is on them. They do not weigh the experience of their victims or account for their preparations or care about the lives waiting for them at the base camp or at home. The avalanche does not choose. The storm does not aim. The serac does not wait for a quiet moment. The eruption does not check whether it is a weekend. What the mountains offer and what they extract as payment is the same thing: the presence of the absolute, the experience of being somewhere that is real in a way that ordinary life rarely manages to be, where every decision has weight, where the consequences are immediate and irreversible, where there is no bureaucracy or abstraction or mediation between you and the raw physics of the world. Some people go looking for that experience and find it magnificent. Some find it and do not survive it. And some, like the 20,000 people under the earth in Yungay and the 63 hikers on the slopes of Ontake, did not go looking for it at all. It simply found them on ordinary days, in places they had every reason to feel safe. Consider what Rob Hall knew, lying on the south summit of Everest in the darkness with his hands too frozen to move. He had been on that mountain 5 times. He had guided 39 other people to the top. He knew Everest better than almost any person alive, and none of that knowledge, none of that experience, none of that competence made any difference when the mountain decided it was done with him. He spent his last hours alive talking to his wife on a satellite phone and telling her not to worry. His body is still there. Consider what the climbers on K2 knew on the night of August 1st, 2008. They were among the best in the world. They had climbed Everest, many of them. They had technically far more challenging peaks than most people will ever attempt. They had done everything right. They had prepared. They had waited for a weather window. They had used fixed ropes for safety. And then a serac that had hung in place for decades chose that night to fall, and none of their preparation could account for the simple physics of ice in motion. Consider what the people of Yungay knew on the afternoon of May 31st, 1970. They knew their mountain. They had lived beneath it for generations. They knew it was steep and glaciated and occasionally dangerous in the way that Andean mountain valleys are always dangerous. What they did not know, because the people who had tried to warn them had been forced to flee the country, was that a section of the north face had been building toward collapse for years. They had been kept in ignorance for the sake of economics and the avoidance of panic, and that ignorance cost 20,000 of them everything. The mountains do not care. They have never cared. They will still be there long after every human being who has ever looked at them in wonder or fear is gone. And somewhere on the slopes of each of them, under the ice and rock and ash and silt and sediment of all the years that have passed since these stories took place, are the people who learned that lesson last. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know this channel is your kind of place. Give it a like if you want to see more, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. It only gets darker from here.